Okay, all right. So, welcome everyone. I'm Richa Mittal, the Executive Vice President and Chief Innovation Officer at the Fair Labor Association, and I'll be your moderator today. And I'm delighted to host this session with two expert guests that we have online. Before we get started, few housekeeping items. First, please share your questions using the Q&A feature, and we'll address them throughout the webinar and also at the end. My colleague Michelle, who is also online, will share some links in the chat function related to the reports that we will be talking about. And finally, we are going to record this session so that we can share it with people who have registered but are not able to attend. So before I introduce the speakers, I would like to provide some background information on this webinar and how this came along. So the Fair Labor Association collaborates with companies, universities, and civil society organizations to improve working conditions in global supply chains. We focus both on manufacturing and agriculture sectors with over 50 member companies participating in FLA accreditation program and an additional 100 plus partner companies involved through collective action workstream and projects. One of our goals has been always to research and eliminate labor standard issues in upstream supply chains and outline the steps that companies can take to mitigate those risks. Previously, in the past, when we surveyed 100 member companies and licensees at the FLA about the perceived risk in their supply chain, leather was recognized as one of the priority issues alongside cotton and rubber. As you can see, FLA throughout the years has published several reports exploring both the production as well as raw material aspects of upstream supply chains in cotton, in rubber, in leather. And this is our latest report. This is all. So our first report was really on the production supply chain of leather goods in India. And after now 7 years, we produced one on the raw material supply chain with which we partnered with Impactt. And that was a fantastic collaboration. Additionally, there are several other reports on commodities used in the food and fragrance industries. In terms of looking at why this upstream supply chain issues are more important and critical to look at is for several reasons. So if we move to the next slide, one is ethical responsibility. So really ensuring fair treatment for workers aligned with the ethical standards and corporate social responsibilities and ESG standards for companies. We also look at legal compliance. Now, many countries have laws against child labor, forced labor, unsafe working conditions. And non-compliances can lead to legal penalties. Very recently, we had case, in the US, for example, a company fined millions of dollars, when child labor was found in their supply chains. Also, in the case of leather specifically, the European Union deforestation regulation requires companies to map and assess their supply chains to ensure that they're not contributing to deforestation or forest degradation. Specifically, companies must identify the countries of origin, trace their supply chain back to specific regions, and verify that their products do not come from areas linked to environmental harm or deforestation. And similarly, by virtue of leather, the use of leather, that also means that stand goods for companies using leather in footwear and garment industries. Also, another reason why companies should be looking at upstream supply chain is while a lot of companies have looked at their tier one, companies have not looked at upstream supply chains, and that could bring a lot of reputation damage, consumer backlash, and loss of trust for companies. Risk mitigation is always what companies look at. But in addition, not just risk mitigation for a company, but also risk mitigation for actually the rights holders. So we have issues like strikes, protests, shutdowns, suppliers having WROs. So again, it can impact product production as well as profitability. Quality and safety is another aspect where fair labor practices often correlate with better working conditions. So again, while companies look at quality and safety, similarly, fair labor practices should be integrated in the DNA of how a company functions. And finally, sustainable growth, respecting labor rights and supporting long-term sustainable supply chains. During the slide, we will hear from Raquel and Andre, and I'm very pleased to introduce both of them to you. So as I mentioned earlier, FLA collaborated with Impactt on the study, and Andre was very helpful in providing information from the ground. Introducing Raquel. Raquel has been with Impactt since 2019 and has worked internationally on research, training, stakeholder interviews, risk mapping and remediation, and while developing practical business-oriented recommendations that align with international human rights standards for clients on garment and manufacturing sectors, which she heads at Impactt. She brings prior experience in sustainability and internal auditing within the packaging and fashion industries. Raquel holds a BA in International Relations and an MA in Business Administration and is fluent in Portuguese, English, German, and Spanish. So if you like to ask a question in any of those languages, Raquel is the one, to respond. And also, it's my pleasure to introduce Andre Campos, who is a research program manager at Reporter Brazil. At the organization, he coordinates investigations into human rights and environmental issues in collaboration with NGOs and global media outlets. He's also responsible for developing methodologies for data collection and cross-referencing. Projects created under his leadership or with his involvement have been recognized by international journalism awards such as the King of Spain Prize, the Gabo Award, the British Journalism Award, and the German Media Development Awards. He has also taught classes and courses on environmental journalism, including at the School of Data by Open Knowledge Brazil. So welcome to both of you. And to get this started, Raquel, I'm going to come to you first. And just to, for you to talk about the research, particularly regarding the leather supply chain, how's the transparency looking like between the various tiers of farms, slaughterhouses, tanneries, and the areas that you were broadly able to identify.
Thank you, Risha. It's a pleasure to be here on the webinar today and to have conducted this research in 2024 with FLA. It has been truly a fantastic collaboration. As Risha said, we have collaborated and basically our research has explored global and Brazilian leather industry and what are the social issues that impact the sector. We engaged a few stakeholders, different stakeholders from the industry on interviews, and we have also done desktop research and document review to fully understand what are the gaps. The aim here was to identify hotspot areas, understand what are the labor and human rights issues that could be identified through a desktop research, and of course, to map the challenges on any existing initiatives to counterbalance the risks that are currently identified. As kind of like a background on the leather industry, of course, this is a huge industry. It's expected to continue growing. There is a recognized rising consumer demand for trending leather products. And of course, it is a big focus. All of what we're doing here, what we did in this research, has a big focus, especially when we talk about due diligence and compliance to regulations. If you go to the next slide, please. I think it's fair to say that leather and meat is a huge topic in Brazil, right? When we talk about leather, 80% of the Brazilian leather is exported, whereas for meat, for beef production, we're talking about only 20% of the total production. Brazil has an interesting organization within the country, which is there is a concentration of cattle farms in the south, where the Pampa region is. There you find a lot of like smaller animals. The leather from those animals are usually used for like the footwear industry, exactly because it's like smaller patches. And the trends that you see from the leather coming from the south is that it's usually exported as a finished leather product. The other concentration of cattle farms in Brazil comes in the north, in the northern part. And that's where most of the wet blue leather is produced. And wet blue is the biggest export from Brazil, according to recent statistics. In the north, the animals are bigger and therefore they're most suited for like upholstery or automotive products. The structure that you see here of the supply chain is not exactly rigid. Sometimes you may have like one single farm that covers kind of the full life cycle of the animal before it goes into a slaughterhouse. But yeah, this is the most common setup. And basically it involves a whole bunch of like farms until like from the point in time that the animal is born until the point in time that the animal goes into the slaughter. So you have birthing farms, rearing farms, fattening farms that may or may not use alternative feed slots to it. And the animal then goes into slaughterhouses. One element that got very evident during the interviews that we conducted is that cattle moves constantly between all of these actors within the supply chain. And they're transferred not only physically from one farm to the other, but also in ownership between the different actors within the supply chain. Once the cow is slaughtered, that's when kind of it finishes the meat industry, and that animal, the meat goes into the further steps for food processing. And that's where the hide is separated and the leather industry starts, right? So hides and skins are then transferred from the slaughterhouses into beam houses for pre-tanning. All of these that I have explained until now usually happens in Brazil, and that's kind of like the main focus of the supply chain in Brazil. The tanneries is where there is a bit of a division of waters, because Brazil does have a very big industry on tanning. They do, apparently in recent statistics, there's about 214 total companies, tanning companies in Brazil, out of which 4 to 5 have really a significant market share. So they are actually responsible for 50% of the volume of hide processing in the country. Everything else from the point in time of the tanning towards the finished good happens outside Brazil to the vast majority, right? The further downstream you go from farms until manufacturing units, the more technologically advanced the units are, the better organized, more covered by national laws, and also covered by audits and certifications, as it's shown here at the bottom. Drawing a bit on the findings that we have on this research, if you go to the next slide, please. We have a lot of areas of concern, let's put it like this, that it should be brought to the attention of companies and consumers. And we clustered it into like 4 areas of concern, let's put it like this. One has to do with the supply chain transparency challenges. There is a very big and recognized lack of transparency between farms, slaughterhouses, and tanneries. And that results in lost information, low product traceability, undisclosed facilities, as it's very common to have like indirect, invisible farms in the supply chain. And of course, low visibility into the working conditions, right? If you think that, for example, 30% of the slaughterhouses in the country are not even inspected by the government, this really shows a chronic lack of visibility on the working conditions. And that, of course, makes traceability not only complex, but almost impossible, right? The second bucket has to do with the human and labor rights issues. I think it's fair to say that at any stage of the leather production process, workers do face significant risks. And if we look into each of the actors in the supply chain, under slaughterhouses, there's a lot of issues with harassment, abuse, mental health issues due to work pressure, gender discrimination, health and safety concerns, and a lot more. On tanneries, the concerns, of course, they have to do with exposure to hazardous chemicals, but also the presence of young workers, temporary jobs, and the lack of unions and worker representation. On farms, as it is expected, most of the issues come from the fact that the jobs are usually informal and inconsistent. So you have a lot of informal ways of working arrangements. not exactly decent accommodations for people working in farms. And there is, of course, a prevalence of low wages, if any, and the risk of modern slavery, therefore. On assembly, which is, of course, outside of the Brazil context, but still very relevant here, is the home working issue, together with low wages, overtime, and, of course, child and forced labor risks. The third point on findings that we have here is around certifications and how there are limitations to those, right? The existing supplier certifications that are currently in place, they have a limited focus on working conditions and on human rights, and they do not go far into the upstream supply chain tiers, so slaughterhouses and farms. And this is a huge problem because that's where the highest risks are located, right? It's worth noting what Risha mentioned just before, that especially given human rights due diligence and deforestation regulations, I don't think companies can afford to just rely on current audits and current certification schemes. There needs to be a bit of a step up on efforts towards visibility and leveraging to drive change in scale, right? And the last bucket here is around the lack of collaboration within all of the actors in the supply chain. It's very evident that leather sourcing companies and meat companies need to be talking to each other and collaborating on a bit of a more structured manner to establish a traceability that is more thorough and to ensure that there is human rights due diligence in full over this value chain. The two supply chains, so meat and leather, they are, of course, intrinsically connected. And of course, the influence, the level of influence of these two industries within the product differs a lot. And I think that whereas meat companies can exercise influence on farmers and slaughterhouses, leather sourcing companies, they will mostly focus and they will be mostly having leverage on tanneries, component makers, and the final assembly units for leather. And combining that and collaborating with each other to have a full visibility of the supply chain is key to drive change here. And that's it.
Yeah, thank you, Raquel. I think, this is one of the areas that we also notice, for example, for the rubber supply chain. When we did the study for the rubber supply chain, we noted that the apparel and footwear industry really uses about 10 to 12% of the global rubber. It's the tire industry, the automobile industry, who actually uses majority of it. So this cross-sectoral engagement is key to bringing about any impactful changes in the upstream supply chains. And this is again the same pattern that we also note in the leather industry. Now, I mean, we haven't packed human and labor rights issues because we wanted Andre to unpack that more. So I would like to bring in Andre now. And, Reporter Brazil as an NGO has been operating on the ground for many years, studying these issues. And how, from your point of view, you observe these human and labor rights exploitation, both in the meat as well as in the leather industry, because again, they're so correlated that we cannot ignore that both industries have to take action. So, Andre.
Thanks a lot, Richard. Thank you, Raquel, also for the presentation. Yeah, I'm going to try to speak a little bit from a local perspective, from the perspective of organization that is investigating human rights abuses in this industry, in this whole supply chain for some years. And I'm bringing here a picture for in the slide for you to see. I think that this is something that could give you an idea on how working in cattle farming in Brazil might look like. I think it's fair to say that certainly at farm level is where we have the most critical and widespread abuses, labor abuses in the supply chain. And in the situation, that those workers face, usually we try to describe as people that are enslaved by promises or bounded by promises. I think it's something that is very common in the sector, and goes more or less like this. Usually, you have a lot of internal migrant workers that are recruited to 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 perform tasks, temporary tasks inside of cattle ranching farms in Brazil. They are moved from distant states and municipalities, hundreds, sometimes thousands of kilometers to work in farms. And when it's happening in the north of the country, many times they are placed in farms that are inside of the Amazon region, uh, distance hundreds of miles sometimes from the next urban centers. And at recruitment, sometimes, usually, you receive promises from the person that's recruiting you to work in this farm, saying that you are going to receive a good amount of money, you're going to be having good housing conditions, food is going to be provided by the employer. But quite often, when you get to the farm, the situation that you find is like you see here in these pictures: workers that are building fences, sometimes working in deforestation to create new farms. There's a strong correlation between deforestation and modern slavery in this sector in Brazil. And they are placed in sheds inside of, forest areas, subjected to all risks involved in this kind of situation. You have snakes, you have animals, you have everything that you can imagine. You don't have even many times, uh, water, you know, drinking water being provided to you. You have to manage yourself how you're going to drink water. Just go to a near riverside, and and then this here you can see what people might be drinking in this kind of place. Food, uh, very precarious. Sometimes they don't provide you enough for you to be able to support yourself during those working days, and sometimes you have to pay it from the employer sells food for you during the time that you are working for him, which is totally illegal according to Brazilian legislation. This should be provided by the worker. And here, in the last picture, you have this notebook here, which is something that many workers that work in this sector, they have faced in the past and in some situations, which is like the debts notebook. You go there and you totally depend on the employer, the farmer, for food in for eat items that you might need to use during those days that you are inside of this farm. You are charged for these items many times, and then you have to pay back with your work. This creates, in many situations, a debt bondage relationship. So you have this, and it's very common in many parts of Brazil. And just if you guys could please go to the next slide, I can give you an idea on numbers of the scale of this issue. Um, Over the past 30 years, official inspections by the Brazilian federal government have rescued um 17,000 workers from conditions analogous to slavery, as is defined by Brazilian legislation, only in cattle farms in Brazil. Is Cattle farm is the single most it is the most important activity in terms of numbers of workers rescued here in the country. And it's been kind of a constant over this last 30 years. And although this number is impressive by itself, you have to consider that certainly it doesn't represent the full amount of cases that we have. Many of the cases that are reported to the authorities are never inspected at all. And of course, we will have many cases that are not even reported to the authorities. It's part really of the local, let's say, culture of how things are done in many regions of Brazil. So and that's how modern slaves go in Brazil. Not necessarily you have to point a weapon, to the worker just to restrict his freedom and impose degrading conditions. They are geographically isolated in farms. They cannot live because simply they depend on the employer just to go somewhere else and be able to get out of these very degrading conditions. Yeah, so you have this in the Farm 11, but we can talk about the issues that we have at the industrial level as well, and we can go to the next slides just to speak a little bit about it. When you consider the next stage of the supply chain, certainly you have issues that are one of the big issues that you have, certainly probably the most important issue is related to the health and safety of the workers in slaughtering houses. Uh, if you take the stats that we have here in Brazil about accidents at workplace, you'll see that the meat industry, the slaughtering houses, they have a higher rate, a higher prevalence of accidents leading to serious accidents. Many times we were talking about the amputations, things like that, than the national average for industrial activities, and also repetitive strain injuries is a big thing in this industry because you have to consider that slaughtering house is a little bit like reminds you a little bit on the image that you have from modern times, Chaplin's movie, assembling line, repetitive movements. Actually, it's a disassembling line in this case, but works kind of in the same way. You are there, trying to keep pace with a production line, and this leads to a lot of repetitive strain injuries. And this is also connected to mental illness in this industry. Workers, many times they face harassment and a lot of pressure just to keep up the speed and be able just to make the cuts, to separate pieces of meat and separate leather from the animals' bodies in a fast pace. This leads to accidents, this leads to pressure, and this also leads to a lot of cases of depression, anxiety in this industry. When you talk about the tanneries, you also have important cases, just like Raquel mentioned, of accidents. You have cases of fatal injuries in this industry that have been reported over the past years. Chemicals, intoxication by chemicals using this process is something that led to big accidents with multiple deaths in tannery facilities here in Brazil. And in general, Brazil has a prevalence of accidents at workplace that are above the average. It's considered to be very high according to international stats. And when we see the industrial activities linked to the meat complex, and its byproducts, slaughtering houses and tanneries, you see that this is even above the average of what we have for industrial activities in Brazil. I think this is summarize the main points, and I'm more than happy to answer doubts after that about these issues. Thanks.
Thank you, Andre. And the stories just remind me of some of the tanneries, I visited in India, for example, um, when the leather, when the hair was being taken out, all these workers were covered in complete hair, and the amount of chemicals they were, literally like chest deep in these chemicals to just wash the leather. So I think the nature of the industry itself is so high risk, and on top of that, of course, the health issues, and one of the findings, of course, of the reports have been that there are a lot of women workers who are actually employed in the slaughterhouses, so that comes with its own gender-based issues as well. So now we know the issues, but I do want to shift our attention to more what can we do about it. And Raquel and I spent some time thinking about recommendations. And Raquel, it would be great to hear what can be done about these issues.
Yes. I think from what we've seen here and what we talked and what can be read on the report, definitely doing something to improve traceability and visibility on the supply chain is key, right? And these here are the strategies that we thought our brainstorm on how to make it happen. I think the number one is that the industry solution, an industry-wide solution is key. One company alone may be able to have visibility of their own suppliers in their own supply chain. And then again, with the caveat that leather sourcing companies will have that until Tenerife, but they wouldn't have visibility to the other actors in the supply chain, right? And of course, because they are concentrated on the only leather supply chain, the leverage and level of influence gets very diluted as further upstream you go, right? So the bottom line here is that it's hard and potentially unnecessary to be the only crusader doing this. So really working as an industry is key. The second element has to do with the fact that leather is a byproduct, and it derives from this point that I just said. If we're talking about a byproduct from the meatpacking industry, talking to the meatpacking industry and bringing them to the table on decisions around how are we going to make this work is essential. Collaborating with them is key, right? I think the next element has to do with the fact that environmental issues are, of course, a very, very important focus, especially when we talk about the northern clusters of farms in Brazil that go into the Amazon forest, as Andre was mentioning before. But of course, the social aspects and the human rights protection is key if we look at all of these things that we're talking about today. So fostering conversations on these human rights protection is key, to be honest. And it is important that the current certifications and audit schemes that are used by the industry players, that they integrate these social criteria, because it's important to involve human rights experts in audits, promote transparency and remediation through these certification systems, and including those conversations on human rights is going to be the only way for us to start tackling those issues that we just talked about. I think the next element is something about rethinking traceability and sustainability. So tagging each and every cow that is involved in the supply chain is not an option, right? As described in the report, it's the way that leather is processed, it just makes it impossible to say that a piece of finished leather comes from the cow X simply because it gets mixed up. It's impossible to have that level of traceability. So one example that we mentioned on the report about risk reduction is working on a cluster-based traceability system. So basically creating an area where you designate kind of like that products coming from this area will meet environmental and social standards due to your efforts on that area. So there is no need for further compliance checks. And like that, you create an area that has lowered risks where you and your partners can source from, right? And another way of thinking about this is going for an area-based approach, as we also mentioned on the report. So that means driving improvements across the supply chain in one specific region, focusing on identifying who are all the actors within the different tiers of the supply chain in one specific area, and drive improvements on various areas, which could be, for example, labor standards, environmental standards, or animal welfare standards, by providing training, capacity building, technical support, and really investing on these stakeholders on that region, right? I think the next element has to do with the indirect farms. Definitely, they are a key actor to pay attention to. They are small, they are informal, they are invisible. and incorporating them, but they are also present, by the way. So incorporating them on the requirements for approved suppliers is a key step. And lastly, lobbying with the government, so advocacy with the government. I think it seems like an impossible task, but as a group, there's a lot that can be done to lobby with the government to, for example, make traceability a norm instead of a voluntary commitment as it currently is. And there could be various different reasons for that. One of them, it could be, for example, that it boosts the exports, but definitely it's an element that is key to make all of these other elements that we talked about today work, is to have the backup of the government to implement requirements on this area. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Raquel. And Andy, I want to bring you in here to talk specifically on how the local right holders or NGOs or civil society organizations can be engaged. So these are some, areas which is an individual company or industry could take and, advocate with the government. But how can local actors be involved, especially the right holders?
Yeah, just following up to what Raquel just posed to us here. We have in Brazil a traceability challenge considering this industry, a big one. And I think that it's important to have pressure, corporate pressure, and civil society organizations pressure, just to improve this. And I think that from our experience here, uh, real improvements, they might come through. They would necessarily have to come through public policies. That's not something that can be solved by companies relying in specific systems created to deal with specific company supply chain. It's simply too complex to see all the steps in the supply chain, because when you talk about indirect suppliers, sometimes you're talking about a third tier, a fourth tier. An animal can just navigate through multiple farms before getting to a slaughtering house. And this is something that really involves public policies changing how we make a traceability, moving towards individual traceability here in Brazil, because simply the company's response, the the projects being developed, although it's very good to know that they are developing projects to track their indirect suppliers, they are very limited in how they can really deliver this as a concrete result. So this is a discussion to have on in terms of bringing all the actors together and make proper pressure for this to take place. And also, I would like to talk a little bit about on what we, because one thing is to have traceability, the other thing is to what we do with this traceability, right? What are the good answers, Right now in Brazil, the most of the big companies that are playing the leather industry, the largest, slaughtering companies, the big meat companies, they all have committed to block suppliers that have been found by the government to be using workforce analogous to slavery. And then, of course, this is very important, and when we can discuss if this is if companies are achieving this goal, you have a lot of loopholes. But anyway, uh, even if you have perfect traceability, this doesn't deal with the full size of the problem, because it's going to deal only with what inspection is seen. And I think that we have still a very, very, weak discussion. It's almost non-existent, in fact, discussion about prevention in this sector. Industry have to prevent, modern slavery to take place in their supply chain, not only act after a red flag was, raised by a specific expression of the government. And I don't see at this point you know, strong coalitions being built around this. And I welcome this approach that Fair Labor Association is proposing because I see that moves toward this direction. And we need to start to have this discussion more seriously. And just talking a little bit about the industrial level, all the issues that we have about working health and safe conditions. I think that here it's important to have the further stages of the supply chain also monitoring what's going on here in Brazil. We over the recently over the past years we have some good examples of what new legislation can do, you know, to improve situation. We have this norm that was approved in Brazil like 10 years ago, basically established the needs for pauses during the work journey for workers to recover, you know, in slaughterhouses. So you do the line works for like 55 minutes or 50 minutes and then stops for 5 or 10. You make some exercise, you rest, and you see that the numbers of cases reported of accidents and repetitive strain injuries, they have lowered. It was very effective. But then you have this cat and mouse game that's being played here because as a a response to this, you see many companies they started to just increase the speed of the line, you know, just to keep the same levels of productivity going on. And then I think it's very important that people that are buying these products that are part of the supply chain also monitor what's going on there, you know, just to make sure that productivity is not being pursued through, you know, human exploitation in a level that's harm people, you know, it just created like a bad situation here in Brazil. Those are some points that I would like to raise it.
Great. Thanks, Andre. And I cannot agree with you more that traceability is a means and it's not the end. Because the reason why we talk about traceability is to reach those workers. If we could reach those workers through other means, we should be doing that. Absolutely. And I also want to emphasize the point that um, a lot of time, many organizations and companies hide behind this narrative of we have no traceability. But again, there are different ways to approach, the work, and this is exactly how we are working with the model that we call as harvesting the future. So if we just move to the next slide, and I want to kind of wrap up this webinar with a thought and something that has worked for the FLA in other countries. So it started in Turkey, and what we saw was that the workers were migrant and the workers were facing same issues in different industries. So we started with the hazelnuts, but the same workers had the same issues in cumin, in apricot. So these were mainly agriculture products. And when we started to map it, what we thought was that, okay, hazelnut companies are only looking at hazelnut. Cumin is only looking at cumin. But what if different sectors came together and talk about these issues from an issue-based and an area-based approach rather than a supply chain only approach? And that's the kind of thinking, I think, a coalition building that is required also in leather sector in Brazil. So if we could put together, again, we meaning the collective we, of stakeholders, to say the meat industry comes together, the leather industry comes together, the apparel and footwear industry comes together, the food and beverage, both the buyers and the suppliers. But what is also very critical in harvesting the future model that we have is the role of the government. And the role of government is from different angles. So it's from legislation perspective, it's from also having that carrot and stick model, because of course they can enforce, and that's one of the questions that I think Sajid is asking. Why is the enforcement weak? If it is there for OHS, why not for others? And I'll go back for you to answer that question. But also in this model, the government are active partners. So it's not just on the companies and the suppliers, but it's really, it's an active participation. And finally, the CSOs, the civil society organizations, play an important role because they are the conscience holders. They are the ones, the critical friends to say, okay, yes, this is what you're doing correctly, or this is what you're not doing correctly. And if we think about the implementation of the efforts, when we work on a child labor free zone approach, or when we work on forced labor issues, the CSOs are the ones who deal with these case management issues day in, day out, not the companies and not the suppliers. So they are the ones really to know, okay, how do we approach this in a manner which is holistic and self-sustaining. So really the multi-sectoral landscape model we started in Turkey, we use in Egypt now, and we use now in India, and again in the cotton supply chain, which is really coming from apparel and footwear, and now going into upstream supply chains. And this is something I think we should be exploring as a coalition of the like-minded, starting small, and for me, what is most critical is eventually it's not about FLA, it's not about impact, it's not about Reporter Brazil. I think the supply chain actors who are there should be taking lead, and people who should be doing the work should be taking lead. But what our role is a backbone or a catalyst function or a facilitator to start with, so that things as they fit in place, we could leave self-sustaining measures. And Raquel, to your point on certification, completely agree. um, um, I think certifications have this infrastructure in place. We should definitely leverage that and really have them focus, also add the human rights and labor rights aspects to it. So what I'll do now is open up for questions, and I think we already have a couple of questions. So one is on, of course, from I think I'll let Andre respond to that one. So, why worker welfare legislations and practices are not that strictly implemented in Brazil compared to occupational health and safety? OHS is important, so is worker welfare. So, they're drawing comparisons between worker welfare and OHS. So, why? I mean, I maybe start with Andre, Raquel, if you want to also address that. What's your opinion?
Yeah, maybe one thing to think about is that issues related to health and safety, they are more more expected and foreseen in industrial places when you compare to situations taking place at farm level. In general, you have a better inspection and a better enforcement of labor legislations in industrial places compared to farm level. And there are multiple reasons why this happens like this, but the most obvious and the most important one is certainly because you have fewer industries. They are more concentrated in the space. They are in urban areas, while farm work, it happens in a wild range of smaller enterprises. I mean, it's quite often very distant from any urban centers. It's really a big, big challenge just to inspect everything that happens. And it's just a so big country, and you consider in the Amazon itself alone, you have like 35 million people living over there. And a lot of what people are doing is farming activities. So it's impossible for us just to think on solving the issues that we have, labor issues, focusing only in labor inspection. Even if we had like the budget of a UN or anything like that, it would still be an enormous challenge just because of the high prevalence of issues that we have, how dispersed they are on the space, and how many people are involved. So I think that's one of the reasons why it's important also to have this alternative approach to deal with this kind of issues.
And if I could add, I think also it's a question of how easy it is to remediate also. I have the feeling that for health and safety issues, you may take some measures, put in place some measures, do some training. And it is very important, don't get me wrong, but it's also easier to remediate than questions, for example, of how relationships within an industrial environment are being held. If workers are being harassed, if workers are being abused, if workers are overworked and therefore have health and safety issues, right? Usually, actually, a lot of health and safety issues found come as a root cause from workers being overworked, tired, not taking breaks, and things like that. So I think that it's from a governmental perspective, there is definitely a focus on health and safety inspections, but also from a company perspective, it's less painful to focus on solving health and safety issues than to actually tackle relationships within the factory, listening to your workers and understand how is the working experience for them, so you can impose changes or propose changes that will make their life better.
Yeah. As we say, compliance is always easier than actually taking care of your workers, because compliance is like, have I done this, and this, rather than spending time and really knowing about how well they are doing. Yeah, and we have a very good comment. I think Farhad Parveen has clearly said that, it's the same issue in Pakistan. I've noted the same issues in India in the leather industry. Bangladesh has been well studied in terms of leather. I think yeah, all of these countries have similar issues. And I mean, the reason why we wanted to bring this webinar or wanted to do this study in the leather sector was, I think as compared to cotton, it's not well talked about. It is talked about when someone comes with a report, but cotton, for example, is on consistent minds, consistently it's on mind of people and of companies. So that's what we want to do with this webinar. And I'm very happy to have, some colleagues. Somo has done some work, so has the New York, NYU Stern Center has done research in Bangladesh. So I think it's really to very concretely think about what are the steps that we all can take in leather, and just in terms of also conversations with companies who are FLA members. They are very conscious, and it's not just FLA members. I think companies in general are really trying to figure out, where do we go next? What do we do? So the recommendation is, please review the report, look at the recommendations. You know who all are on this webinar, and we have our contact information on the next slide. If you have any questions, please reach out to us. And again, we are here. So I would say that, if you really feel like having this coalition of the like-minded work on leather, please feel free to reach out to either, the three of us, or any one of us. And yeah, we are also keen to see what next steps we can take. So with that, seeing no more questions, I would just really like take time to thank both Raquel and Andre for this excellent opportunity to work with you, as well as, for this webinar, and hope we can continue to talk about this issue, and really take some concrete actions as next steps. So Michelle kindly is putting the contact information in chat. So if you want to take it, please have it. And we'll finish 5 minutes in advance, so we'll give you gift of time. Thank you both, and thank you everyone who is attending the session. And we will share
Thank
the
you
recording.
all.